Good afternoon, American culture. British and American culture, rather. Today we're talking about American culture. I guess I'm changing the title just for convenience. There's a lot of things to talk about today, and it's always my goal to keep us under 40 minutes. Various people had different things to say, feedback on the course. It's difficult to teach this course online. It's been a challenge last semester and this semester. I'm trying to make it more interesting. It's always better if you give constructive feedback to the professor so that there's something I can adjust. If there's something that you, in particular, that it bothers you, then that's the best thing to comment. Just saying the class is not interesting isn't really that helpful. It doesn't really tell me exactly what needs to be changed. And of course, I can't change everything for everyone. There are 51 students and everybody has a different opinion. Some people like the class and say it's interesting. Some people don't. If you don't like this kind of course content and learning the details about American and British culture, it's going to be hard to entertain you or keep you interested. However, I think one of the things is making the lectures a little bit shorter would be good. Sometimes I get carried away with stories, but I think the stories are also the most interesting parts. So I'm using my board today. It's very messy. There's a lot of stuff on it, and I'll get to it in a minute. But first of all, we have decided to do our exam on December the 10th, okay? Now we've already done our makeup class. It's our makeup class day. So the plan is to have our exam that day instead of the following week. So there will be no class because we are essentially 1 week ahead. I'm sort of a half a week behind because I sort of added another lecture in before the quiz number 4 because of the Zoom lecture. And as you know, on Wednesday, I uploaded a lecture Wednesday morning and then we had a quiz Thursday morning. I'm sorry I did that to you. I was feeling sick earlier this week and I was unable to do this kind of marathon recorded lecture in time. That's not going to be a problem this week because today is Friday. And you'll see this lecture later today or tomorrow before the week resets. And then the second lecture will come on Monday. So then you'll have, Tuesday, Wednesday, from Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday to watch the video lecture and prepare yourself. Next Thursday is the last quiz. As I told you, and students keep asking me how much of the quiz is worth. I changed the amount. Originally, it was 5 quizzes out of 6. So each quiz was worth 4%. But we had some issues with Google Forms and the CNU portal when we were experimenting with how the quizzes work online. I think everything's smoothed out now, but the first 3 quizzes, some people missed them because of technical problems. So each quiz is worth 3%. So it's 15% total for your top 5 quizzes out of 6. I hope everybody writes quiz number 6. If you've got a high grade on the first 5, then you don't have to write it if you don't want to. But of course, it helps you prepare for the exam. All of the quizzes have information that is useful for the exam, so you should be studying that stuff anyway. All right, there's a second assignment. We did one assignment. I actually graded them about a week ago. I finished inputting the grades into a spreadsheet and I just totally forgot to upload it. So I apologize. I shouldn't laugh, but it seems like everything gets confused when nobody's in the classroom in front of me reminding me that I actually have real students. So I will, that's the last piece of grading that I needed to do left over from the halfway point. So that'll be uploaded later today. So you can just look at the spreadsheet, find your student number, look at the letter grade, and that's what you got on your first assignment, okay? The second assignment is just like the first one. And let me remind you, you have to be honest. You have to do your own research and find some information and then write using your own words, okay? It's very important that you do that. If you don't, it's plagiarism. I can see that you've copied it. It's very obvious. Some students got 0. on their assignments, and that's cheating in the class. Technically, if you do that on the exam or you do that on an assignment, you don't just get 0 on that assignment, you get 0 in the class. And that's ruining your entire semester's effort. So please don't do that, because that's what the result will be. The second assignment is, of course, on American culture, and I would like you to talk about a contradiction in American culture. So you have 2 weeks to do this, okay? There's a quiz next Thursday, and this is going to be due the following Thursday, which I believe is December 3rd, okay? I'm not looking at a calendar, but I believe that's December 3rd, and then December 10th is the exam. So we have next Thursday, quiz, the following Thursday, assignment, and then December 10th, final exam. And that's it. That's all that's left in the class, okay? So I'll be doing lectures, and I'll be doing one final lecture of review that same week, December 3rd, in order to help you prepare. That weekend, I'll upload a final sort of half-week lecture to give you some review over the material. And yeah, we're moving through the textbook at the normal pace. So here we are. The chapter is called A Tale of Two Empires. And of course, we talked about imperialism last week. And that's a word that the Americans dislike intensely, for obvious reasons, because we talked about the American Revolutionary War, and that the whole thing was to disconnect themselves from the British Empire and that system of imperialism. But what happens when you consolidate colonies into states, and then states into a nation, and the nation grows and gets more powerful and starts having influence on other areas and other countries? You end up behaving in an imperious way. The similarities between America and Rome are often talked about because, quite frankly, they borrowed a lot of structure, legal structure. They have a Senate. They are a republic, just like the Romans were. And so they built on the Western tradition that the Romans established in the Roman Empire, but they don't call themselves a Roman Empire. It's the Republic. Things can come dangerously close, though, to imperial, in all aspects except for name. The country can end up behaving like an imperial power. I want to talk about the transformation, though, because that's really the American Empire sort of it's not George Washington's country. That's George Washington's country actually is a bunch of British colonies that are stuck together, through their common resistance to the British Empire and through his charisma and personal leadership. When George Washington passes away, that's what the state is. So we want to talk about the transformation that happens in the next 100 years, right up to the 20th century. And things will start to feel a lot more familiar when I talk about them now. I've already talked to you about a few themes, right? Major themes about what Americans really believe. That's back in my notes here. I talked about Dr. Alan Gelzo's, main themes in his course, how he talked about education, popular government, rights of people to rule themselves, belief in their special status. These are major themes that he points to that arc over the entire history of American culture. I want to talk about more like specific events that reveal to us certain things about America's, transformation, because it's not the same country it used to be. Just like all cultures, it's constantly evolving. Again, that's one of the reasons the title of the textbook is Evolution and Revolution, because America is a revolutionary culture, but it's constantly changing. And then there's these big moments like the Revolutionary War, and like we're going to talk about next class, not this class, the American Civil War, arguably another event that marks a huge change in American culture, which we can point to as being revolutionary. So I want to talk about, first of all, let's go to the board. There's a list here on the top. So the first thing I want to talk about is the religious revival period that happens as America starts to grow, as it becomes a country and it starts to expand. The British Empire actually put the brakes on the expansion of, that's one of the issues that the Americans had, was that they were not supposed to enter native territory. And there's sort of, a line, there's a mountainous line, the Appalachians, and, the separation between the interior of the continent and the coast. That line was supposed to be preserved. And colonists and settlers were not supposed to enter that territory because it was decided by the British Empire that territory would belong to the natives, and that British colonists shouldn't intrude. However, a lot of people wanted, because of the crowding, because of the population increase and the settlement and the arrival of new populations from Europe, the population pressure on the East Coast and the lack of land for them caused them to cross the mountains anyway and start coming into contact with native cultures and regions that were previously not allowed to be developed. That's going to be, we're going to talk about that next class, although this kind of goes on from the very beginning of the American experience until now. We're not going to talk about it right now because next class, we're going to talk about the Civil War and about the native peoples of America in the same lecture. And the Civil War will be a specific period, and we'll be talking about important people like Abraham Lincoln. And then the native discussion will talk about groups of people, and it'll cover hundreds of years of the contact between native people and Europeans. So this great revival, what they call the religious revival, the Great Awakening, it's referred to that because in the original Constitution, and because of the whole emphasis on legal matters and diplomatic matters and taxes and patriotism and representation and philosophy, there was kind of a disconnect between the religious effort of the Puritans and the Catholics and the Lutherans and all manner of other types of religious communities that moved to America. Gradually, they sort of got disconnected from that effort. And the Puritans themselves noticed that every generation, that radical energy that drove them to leave Europe and leave England in the first place and land in Plymouth and create Massachusetts and Connecticut and New England, that energy was disappearing. And so there was an effort, there was sort of like a subtle at first effort to reclaim that tenacity and connection with Christianity, and it picked up speed, and there became a new generation of enthusiasts and quite capable speakers and preachers and leaders that caused an explosion of church building and church community growth. So unlike the British culture that we see now, the Anglican culture, where it's sort of like a very old tradition of boring, ritualized attendance, obligatory attendance on Sundays, and that people don't feel a really close attachment to in their daily lives, at least. English people are very less likely to be religious in their behavior. British people, not just English, excluding the Irish, because the Irish tend to be a little bit more devout, I think. That's a general statement, though, not individuals. But as a whole, the American culture is much more. They have all kinds of different versions that of Christianity have multiplied, and they have super churches, and they have particular groups and styles, and a mixture, a very multicultural, multi-sectional kind of way of worshiping. All kinds of different, but there's major churches, like the Presbyterian Church in America is a very large and well-attended church, and they were very instrumental in converting Korean people, and that's why Changlo Gyohwae is the biggest church in Korea, because there was a lot of American missionaries that came over. There were some Canadian ones too. That Presbyterian church is descended from the Scottish. The Scottish brought it over, and the Americans transformed it into their own sort of brand of Presbyterian church. I have a lot of experience with this because my father is actually a Presbyterian minister. So I have been to events with the Presbyterian Church of America and the Cumberland Presbyterian Church and the Canadian Presbyterian Church, and I've been to Presbyterian Church in Korea, and they're all different, even though they have a common background. They all evolved in different ways. And this is all kind of part of this religious revival that in the early 19th century was part of the transformation of America into what it is now. As I said, if you go to America, you'll find a lot more people attending church and invoking God when they do things, and being members of churches and being involved in church communities. It's a lot more common than in British culture, and to be frank, in Canadian culture too. Secondly, the transportation revolution. We talked about the Industrial Revolution, and I did put industry underneath that too, because they're connected to each other. The Industrial Revolution kicked off because steam power was used. Actually, originally it was just used to power any sort of machine that could make textiles, be produced faster. But at a certain point, they realized they could adapt this power source to mining, and they could pump water out of coal mines, and the coal was, the coal and charcoal is required in order to make steam power. So they're kind of, again, getting connected, but they started to use steam to pump water out of mines, holes in the ground that were flooded. Once they had done that, I guess it was a short leap for some engineer, usually a Scottish engineer, as the stereotype goes, but English or British, Scottish, English, British. That person would there were particular people that adapted the steam power to moving something, which is why the original word for train is locomotive, because locomotion means to move something, right? Motion is moving something, and you need a machine to make motion happen. And they originally managed to construct this enormously heavy thing, which could be powered by steam and move down a track, just like a cart would move down a mine rail into a hole. Once they could get this thing going, the problem was it was too heavy, so it actually break the rails because it was so heavy. But once they figured out how to make it a little bit lighter, stronger and lighter, they could actually start moving down a track. And this is the beginning of trains, right? And you can think about it, I guess we have to, you and I, being the age that we're in, you can think of it like you think about airplanes. You're probably too young, but to remember, how airplanes even recently have gotten, faster, and the connections have increased. Like when I was young, there weren't, even when I came to Korea, there wasn't a direct flight on my airline, on Air Canada. There was no direct flight from Seoul to Toronto. I had no choice. I had to stop in Tokyo or stop in Vancouver and connect. And as you know, connections are pretty terrible, especially if your flight with a connection is 18 hours and without a connection it's 14 and a half. Makes a big difference when you're just adding 3 hours on to 14, I feel. This is sort of what trains were like when they first came around. Trains were really slow and there were very few connections, but by the end of a 50-year period, they're crisscrossing everywhere. First in the United Kingdom, but then in the United States. As the United States started going west, this had to happen. There really was no way that anybody could live out in a sort of desert, very dry, not always desert, but grassland prairie environment where there wasn't very much water, and there wasn't any trees. There's nothing to burn for firewood or anything. These people started moving out into this open field area, and there wasn't any materials for anything to build with. They literally were building, their houses in hills and cutting, this stuff is called sod in English. It's very deep, thick, and heavy dirt. And they would dig these holes into a hill, and that's what they would live in, a sod house. And these things were terrible because, water would come through the ceiling and snakes would be crawling around in your bed. And then after it rained, you'd have to throw buckets of water out of the house. And, when you wanted to cook something, all the smoke would have to go through a hole in the dirt ceiling. Like you're living in a cave. That's what a lot of these people were living in. Trains enabled the transportation of all these things, like things that you take for granted, like windows, right? Windows were a new thing. So this is why I'm talking about the transportation revolution in connection to industrial production too, because everything that you have now, everything that's in your apartment, just look around, look at the desk and the door and the wall and the window. There's glass and there's steel and there's plastic and there's wood. All of those things we don't think about at all. But all of these things were being invented. Not plastic, it's ways off, but glass, right? Paned glass and framing things and wooden doors and doorknobs made. All of these things, some of them would already be invented, but at least they were being produced in factories. So you could make thousands of doors instead of one person making a few doors for a few houses. You have a door factory, and the door factory makes 10,000 doors, and you put those doors on trains, and then you move them across the United States to a town, right? And then the people in the town, they grow some food, whatever it is, corn, potatoes, some sort of crop. They sell it, and they buy doors. And then you have this exchange of goods. This is Adam Smith's capitalism going crazy. Okay, so this is what happens is the westward movement is driven by this transportation revolution. In the East, at first, before the railroad arrives, the technology arrives from Britain, they dig canals and ships move things. One of the most famous engineering projects at the beginning of the United States in the early 19th century is the Erie Canal, which goes from basically where Niagara Falls is. They dug this huge, long canal. It's several hundred kilometers. I'm not sure the total length of it, but hundreds of kilometers. And they managed to dig this canal. They invested a lot of money in it, but it enabled ships to go all the way from up near Detroit, all the way to the Hudson River, down to New York City. And once they were able to do that, the speed and the cost dropped. It was 10 times cheaper. They could send 10 times as many things because the ship could carry so much more than a horse or a cart or a person, and or an ox or something like that, a domesticated animal. And the cost dropped. The cost became much cheaper, and they could send a lot more, a lot faster. And it's like 100 times more efficient to send stuff by ship from Detroit, from up near Niagara Falls, down through that canal to New York. So it just speeds up everything. So everybody has the ability to exchange more goods. And again, this is kind of like capitalism being born, and then immediately not being, I guess born is not the best. It's like being, I was going to say on steroids. It's like, that's probably a bad metaphor. You know what I mean. It's like giving capitalism superpower. It's born as a baby, but the baby is the Incredible Hulk. So it immediately transforms into a green monster, and it's 100 times stronger than it was 20 years before that. So this is what the transportation revolution does. The industrial production in the East, connected to new places by the railroad, causes this accelerated growth that basically once people see this as happening, everybody's sort of looking at America like it's a sleeping giant. It's such a huge place with such fast economic growth that at some point it's going to take over. It's going to become this, important. Eventually, it's going to become this superpower, this world power. It's just waiting for it to grow into its own shoes. It's the same kind of thing that we say about China. China's already there. It's not a sleeping dragon anymore. But 40, 50 years ago, everybody saw the potential for China to become a world power, but it was not there yet. And that's how everybody looked at America in the 19th century too. It was this place with an incredible potential, and you could just see things turning. Benjamin Franklin, way back in the 1750s and 1760s, he thought that eventually America would have to separate, even if it wasn't by war, because he saw that America would be bigger, stronger, have more people, have a larger economy, and that a small country in the corner of northwestern Europe was not going to rule over this giant. Eventually, it was going to happen naturally anyway. So he recognized that 100 years before it actually happened. All right, again, related to this transportation revolution and this industrial power that's being developed is the resource extraction that occurs. So they start finding all kinds of things. One of the things that Koreans envy, if you're from another country, you may be less envious, like me. I'm from Canada. I'm not really that jealous of American, space or resources. But if you're from a smaller country that has a lot of people and there's high competition for resources, you look at America and you think, wow, they're never going to run out of anything, because they've got mountains and forest and desert and coast and jungle and everything. They have everything they need. They have fresh water. They have all kinds of things. They're very fortunate that way. And so as they discovered these things, especially things, eventually there would be oil that they would find. But originally, one of the things that they found was gold. And this caused a rush of people, which ended up developing California, essentially. Other areas ended up being having gold deposits too. South Dakota was one of them. There were various places. There was iron being mined in some places, and coal being mined in other places, and gold was discovered, and silver was discovered in other places. It's a very mineral-rich country. As these things were discovered, they were developed, and people moved towards them to gain their fortune, to get rich quick, to discover, to start their life over again. And then, of course, there was also these big companies and people who were already rich who would invest in them and develop them and turn them into big resource extraction centers like gold mines. Just like you would think, what you see in movies or you see in documentaries, these big giant pits where they're digging down, and there's hundreds of people working in them. That started to develop. Gold mining, panning for gold was more of a lottery thing in many cases, where people were trying their luck. But in certain places there was digging going on, and that's the only way that you could get into it. So there were huge companies and rich investors who were taking advantage of that too. All right, second thing in my list, I want to talk about the political system, and I don't want to get into this in too much depth because I think it's confusing, but it's important, okay? Like a lot of things in this class, like the English Civil War, I just say, okay, the king's on one side, the parliamentarians on the other, the king's basically Anglican, the parliamentarians are basically Puritan. It's not as simple as that. It's the same thing with this story that I'm telling you about American politics, but I think this gives you a general idea of what's going on with American politics anyway. Do they hate each other that much? Well, yes, they do. But there's a kind of ebb and flow to American political history, and politics are politics. Sometimes people do things for power. They don't do them because of logic. They don't do them for the benefit of people. They just do it so that they can keep control. And this has happened throughout American history. And this is one of the things that people compare America to Rome about, because Romans loved legal, they loved legal challenges. They loved to use the law, and they loved to use politics in order to secure power. Julius Caesar is my favorite Roman, and he was a mastermind of political genius that the world has seldom seen. And he was very aware of the legal possibilities that people could use to strip him of his political power. He was very conscious of this. And you can see this with currently, I hate to bring it up, but Donald Trump and Joe Biden, the whole situation. It's very fresh, and the results are ongoing, but at some point we were going to have to talk about this. Actually, one of the comments a few years ago, it was 4 years ago actually, in 2016 when Donald Trump got elected, I guess I was a little bit caught up in the whole thing. And one of the comments that the students made, speaking of constructive comments or not constructive comments, one of the students said, please don't talk about Donald Trump so much. That was the comment at the end of the class. And I was like, did I talk about him that much? I don't think I talked about him that much. But obviously that student didn't like Donald Trump interfering with my discussion of kings and queens and other things. Otherwise, they wouldn't have mentioned that. So I've tried to keep quiet on the Donald Trump stuff since then. But this is happening now. And this is a result of political factionalism, which is basically the result of a two-party system. The thing that you need to know is that originally there was no party system at all. There was George Washington. And they said, George, do you want to be king? And he said, no, I'm going to be the president, but I'm tired. Can't I go back to my farm? And they said, no, please be the president. And then he was president twice, and then he went back to his farm, and then he died. That's how the American presidency started. And after that, nobody did more than 2 terms until FDR broke the rule. But we'll talk about that later. Anyway, a lot of the things in American politics were just by precedent because they didn't have a long history like England, where there's no constitution. In England, there's no constitution. It's the Magna Carta, right? And it's the precedent of, the legal process and precedent of Parliament establishing its sovereign power. We talked about that. There's no document. But in America, there's a constitution, but that document is not enough. So they've amended it many times. And, the Supreme Court also makes judgments based on that document, and they have to extend it sometimes. You know how I always say in composition class, you got to use your critical thinking skills, take the example or the idea that's in the writing and then apply it to something else. That's essentially what the Supreme Court the Supreme Court Justice Department does. Those 9 members have to decide. Sometimes the cases are, the internet or something. These cases are not really, they're not really described in the Constitution that was written in the 1770s and 1780s. So, originally you have these people that are basically federalists, like George Washington. Federalist just means they want to have a country as a federal government. States are individual governments, and then the whole government of the whole country is federal. So George Washington isn't a federalist, but the people who follow his example, they're federalists. And Thomas Jefferson, who was in the government of George Washington because everybody respected him, after Washington was gone, Jefferson had a different idea. He was always sort of a big fan of the French Republic, which was created through the process of the French Revolution. He had to change his mind about that after everything went crazy, but he basically thought that America should be a republic. So he created this party. They were called the Democratic Republicans, but because that's super confusing, because we have 2 parties now, the Democrats and the Republicans, I'm just going to call them Jeffersonians. Okay? So first of all, you have the Federalists. They lose power. Jefferson wins, and he becomes president. And then, the Federalist Party kind of fades away. So there's only the Jeffersonians, but they don't last by themselves for that long. So another party starts to challenge them, the Democrats and the Whigs. And there's only ever two parties at a time. So the Democrats end up rising to challenge the Jeffersonians, and the Jeffersonians lose power. So then there's the Democrats, and Andrew Jackson is the president who gets that party going. And then these Democrats end up losing to the Whigs. The Whigs challenge their authority, and eventually Abraham Lincoln wins. And when he wins, there's a kind of transition from the Whig Party into a Republican Party. So you have Abraham Lincoln with the modern Republicans coming from about 1854, and the Democrats who were established in 1828. And then those are the two parties that really never lose power. There's sometimes a third party, but the third party never wins. Sometimes the third party steals enough votes from a Democratic Party candidate or a Republican Party candidate. But basically, all you have to remember is Republicans are Abraham Lincoln, and the Democrats are Andrew Jackson. And the Democrats actually were the party of the South. So they're the racist ones, right? And the Republicans are the party of Abraham Lincoln. So they're the ones who freed the slaves. At a certain point later in American history, they flip, right? And then you get the modern Republican Party that Donald Trump is a part of, although he has changed things quite a bit. So you can't really say it's the same as Abraham Lincoln's party at all. But the Democrats, of course, they had the first black president, which I'm sure Andrew Jackson would be completely shocked by, or any of the other Democratic Party members, that their party, the party that tried to fight on the side of slavery in the Civil War, became the party that eventually had the first African American president, Barack Obama. But that's evolution. So slowly over time, the parties switched their positions and on many topics. But the main thing is there's always two parties, and this is a big problem because the Constitution is not designed for two parties. It's actually not designed for parties at all. So it's supposed to be just George Washington's, somebody who is only interested in the country's welfare, not in their own political faction. But that's not how things went. So now we have Joe Biden and Donald Trump. That's the end of my story. Okay. So a constant theme here is that throughout this whole thing, westward expansion is happening. There's a frontier. There's an edge that opens up, and it opens up. And next class, we're going to talk about Civil War, conflict with Native Americans, and eventually closing the frontier because they reach the edge. They reach Oregon and California, and they fill up the interior, and they take Texas from Mexico, and then you end up with the United States as this contiguous continental country. And some of these things like the frontier fade away, and the native people, there's not a significant number of them left, so their impact also diminishes going into the 20th century. But they should not be forgotten, of course. So next class, Civil War, westward expansion, a continued westward expansion, and talking about the Native Americans and their effect on American development in the 19th century as well. Okay, so thank you for listening. Remember what I said: quiz next week, assignment the following week, exam the week after that. All right, have a great day, and you can expect the next installment of this week's lectures to come Sunday or Monday. Have a good day.